This is General Election 2019. So we are conducting a series of interviews with Christian representatives from the major political parties to decide who you should vote for come Thursday, the 12th of December, decide which party should be our next party of government. And in today's programme, I'm joined by Labour candidate Stephen Timms. Warm welcome to the programme.
Thank you, Simon.
Tim, I'll start off with you firstly, because you've been a man of stature in the House of Commons. You've represented Christians throughout this country, and you've done so much for faith in this country. So firstly, I want to say, on behalf of our viewers, thank you for what you've done in Parliament. But can I start off with your personal story for those who haven't seen any previous election interviews with yourself? How did you come to faith in Jesus Christ, and how do you get involved in politics?
Well, I'm not from a Christian family. My parents weren't churchgoers, but I started going to what was then called Crusaders as a teenager and came to faith along with my brother in Farnborough Crusaders. I went to university. I'd always been interested in politics, but at university I spent most of my time in the Christian Union. I didn't do anything political. But one summer, our college Christian Union helped out on a tent mission on Wanstead Flats in the borough which I now represent in Parliament. We were there for 2 weeks, that was all. I'd never been anywhere like it in my life before. I grew up in Hampshire. This was inner city Newham, where life was very different, but I loved it. It was a fantastic 2 weeks that we had. I really enjoyed working with the Christians who were living and worshipping there. And when I left university a couple of years later, I got a job in London. I needed somewhere to live. The only place I knew in London was Newham, where we'd had the mission. So I went and rented a room in the house owned by one of the mission team. By that time, the team had planted a church, the church that we now call Plaistow Christian Fellowship, which I'm a member of still 40 years later. And on moving into Newham, given that I'd always been interested in politics, I decided to join the Labour Party as well, partly because I wanted to be committed to the local community, to be part of the local community and involved in what was happening alongside my membership of our church.
So what is it about the Labour Party and its values that attracted you to actually join in the first place?
Well, the Labour Party, of course, has got very strong roots in Christian faith. It was the Methodist chapels, really, that were the foundation for the early growth of both the Labour movement, the trade union movement, and the Labour Party. And it's that commitment to fairness which is the key thing for me about Labour. The roots in the trade unions, which sometimes causes a bit of problems. But the reality is, what that means is, because the funding is coming from the trade unions, in the end, the Labour Party sides with working people. Other parties are dependent on rich people, we're not. And that does mean that the Labour Party is able to take a very distinctive position politically, which other parties can't, and it's the position that I want to identify myself with. Ordinary people, ordinary working people in our country.
Tim, you've been a Member of Parliament since 1994. That's a long time, so you're a long-standing Member of Parliament. You also served as the Chief Secretary to the Treasury under the Premiership of Gordon Brown. But what would you say has been your greatest achievement, and what's your proudest moment in politics?
Well, there's a number of things I'd point to. I think as a minister, and I was a minister for 12 years under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, it was probably the introduction of the Teach First programme, which I was responsible for as Minister for Schools, which is a programme which attracts very bright graduates into schools, gives them the opportunity to teach for 2 years after a kind of crash induction course, on the basis that having completed that programme, they are in a very strong position, if they choose to go on to a corporate career, to win jobs in some of the most prestigious companies in the country. And those companies are supporters of the Teach First programme. It was quite a controversial idea when it first started. It was actually an American idea. I went to the US as Minister for Schools to see how it worked and was impressed. And when I came back to the UK, there were people in London wanting to take that idea forward, and we introduced it. And it really has been transformational in bringing in very bright young people into the teaching profession, particularly in hard-pressed schools, difficult schools, challenging communities like the one I represent. And we've seen a phenomenal improvement in school standards for a number of reasons, but the Teach First programme was a very important one. So I think ministerially that was probably... there are other things I'd point to. One is, which really goes back before I was a Member of Parliament, I was the chair of the Planning Committee and then leader of the council in the borough of Newham, which I represent. And in the 1980s, I started a campaign to bring the international passenger station on the high-speed rail link to the Channel Tunnel to Stratford. I had the station at Stratford. We thought it would take 6 months. We'd have a campaign and we'd almost certainly lose, but it was worth a try on behalf of our community. In fact, it took 11 years. Eventually, it was John Prescott who decided there would indeed be a station at Stratford, and having won that station, they started to build it. Then somebody came up with the idea, well, why not have the Olympic Games with the stadium at Stratford? So on that basis, I claim the credit for the Olympic Games as well. I think one or two other people might claim the credit there. But so I'm very committed to the constituency I represent and take a lot of pride in progress we've seen in that area in the future. Currently, I'm campaigning on behalf of students in my constituency, overseas students, who were falsely accused some years ago of cheating in an English language test. I'm absolutely certain they did not cheat. They've been dreadfully treated, I'm afraid, as part of this government's hostile environment towards migrants. They're gradually winning appeals thanks to the evidence that we've unearthed in Parliament, but I'm hoping the new government will recognise that this group was very unjustly treated and give them a clearance of the accusations made against them.
And Tim, you are the Labour Party's faith envoy. What does that role entitle, and what is your remit?
Well, it was actually Gordon Brown first gave me this job, and then Ed Miliband renewed it, and Jeremy Corbyn did as well. And it's a responsibility on behalf of the party to liaise with faith groups of all kinds. I'm a member of Christians on the Left. I was chair of it for a while, but I want to engage with Muslims, with Hindus, with Sikhs, with Jews as well, on behalf of the party. And I think that the perspective that I'm bringing to this is a recognition that political parties very often say to people of faith, well, you are a person of faith, that's very good, we respect that, but when you come and talk to us about policies, please leave that behind you when you come into the conversation. And my view is that really is not good enough. We need to recognise that actually people's religious faith, their convictions, are key to their identity. And it's quite wrong to suggest to people they should kind of forget about that when they get involved with politics. And actually, religious faith is the best starting point there could be for politics, because it's the source of exactly the values that we need to make politics work. Responsibility, solidarity, patience, persistence, compassion, truthfulness. Those are values that are, frankly, have been eroded over the last few years in our common life. We need them to be renewed if trust in politics is to be restored. And what's happening in the churches, what's happening in the other faith groups, for me, is the best hope we've got of those values being renewed. So we need to recognise that in talking to faith communities. They're not doing us a favour by coming to talk to us. We need them to engage with us to help us renew the politics of our country, which has been in such a sad state for some time now.
And sadly, so many Bible-believing Christians who are on the front line of politics are finding life extremely difficult. There's even a purge of Christians in some political parties, even refusing them to actually stand in this election. We also see that Christians are marginalised as well in society as well. So what are your thoughts on this issue, and how would a Labour government protect Christian freedoms?
Well, I'm pleased to say Christians are not marginalised in the Labour Party, and indeed we've, for the first time for this election, produced this document, our Race and Faith Manifesto. And what I think that reflects is a recognition, of course everybody will accept, that your race is very important to your identity. What we recognise in the Labour Party is that your faith is very important to your identity, and we need to recognise and respect and engage on that basis, and that's what this manifesto for the first time does. It's available on the Labour Party website under the manifesto section. But there are some important commitments in there. For example, there is a commitment there to appoint a figure in a Labour government whose job it would be to protect and enhance freedom of religion and belief, both outside the UK, and the Bishop of Truro did an important report not long ago for the current government that we welcome the recommendations of, but also within the UK. We would want that responsibility to embrace freedom of religion and belief in the UK as well. We think that's an important contribution that needs to be part of the government. We've said that we want officials in British embassies overseas to be trained in religious literacy to respond when the country in which they are serving has problems of religious persecution, to respond on behalf of Britain. And they need some training to enable them to do that, particularly if they're not believers themselves. We want Home Office officials who are assessing people's applications for asylum where it's on religious grounds, and there's a fair number of people, I've met quite a number from Pakistan, for example, who've come to the UK seeking asylum on religious persecution grounds, who get very poor treatment from our Home Office. So we want the Home Office officials to be trained in religious literacy and to understand the kind of problems that persecuted believers have in other countries as well. So that's an important step. Those are important measures that we want to introduce in government. But more broadly, I want us to recognise just how valuable, indeed invaluable, and positive the contributions that churches are making to life in every community, in every part of the UK.
Absolutely. There's one faith-based community that I want to discuss, and that is of the Jewish community. Now, it's believed that around 80-90% of the British Jewish community are fearful of Jeremy Corbyn becoming a next leader. We've also seen the intervention of the chief rabbi, which is unprecedented. We are seeing unprecedented rise of Jew hatred in this country on the records we haven't seen since the start of the Second World War. And it doesn't seem that Jeremy Corbyn, your leader, is doing anything to address this. You've had a number of Labour MPs who have left the party over this issue. Can you reassure the Jewish community that they would be safe under a Labour government?
Well, I was present at the launch of our Race and Faith Manifesto earlier this week when Jeremy was asked about this, and he gave a very clear commitment to fight against anti-Semitism and indeed racism and of all kinds in every aspect of our life. Now, you're absolutely right. The chief rabbi made a very, very strongly worded complaint and accusation against Jeremy and against the party earlier this week. I was pleased that other Jewish groups since then have come forward and said that they don't agree with what he said. But there certainly is a high degree of worry in the Jewish community, which we need to recognise and to respond to. And actually, we have changed processes within the Labour Party. You mentioned people leaving the Labour Party. Well, a number of people have been thrown out of the Labour Party because there has been a problem of anti-Semitism on quite a small scale, but a significant scale. And we have dealt with it. We will need to continue to deal with it. I'm absolutely sure we'll need to do more than we've done so far. But I hope that looking at what's happened and what happens in the future, the Jewish community will be reassured, because that community makes an absolutely vital contribution to our society and to our communities, and they need to feel absolutely safe. One of the points in our Race and Faith Manifesto is to ensure that there is adequate funding to protect synagogues, because there have been quite a number of attacks on synagogues and actually on mosques, and in some cases on churches as well. We want to make sure there is the protection available to ensure that those attacks don't continue.
And Stephen, what's your position, your party's position on Brexit? Because it's for the general public, it seems to be a confusing one, because Jeremy Corbyn says that he wants to get a new deal from the EU, then offer a referendum, but he actually won't clarify which side he will actually campaign on. So for the general public, it looks like the Labour Party is sitting on the fence on this issue, and particularly during the last election when you backed Brexit in 2017. Now it seems very unclear. What is your position?
Well, I've thought a lot about this, because I'm a member of the Brexit Select Committee in the House of Commons, and have been ever since it was established after the 2016 referendum. If you look at the position that other parties are taking, you've got the Conservative position, which is to go ahead with leaving the EU on the basis of the deal that Boris Johnson has negotiated, which would be a very, very damaging deal for the British economy. All sorts of economic problems will be caused if we crash ahead with that. On the other hand, you've got the Liberal Democrats saying, well, cancel Brexit, forget about it, pretend the referendum never happened, and I don't think that's a viable way forward either. So our proposal, and I think it's a completely sensible proposal, is that we want to put the decision back to the British people. We will want to negotiate some alterations to the deal that Boris Johnson has come up with. Many, but there'll need to be some to deal with some of the more damaging aspects of it. And then the people should have the choice: do you want to go ahead with leaving the EU on the basis of this deal, or, having looked at the details, would you prefer to remain in the EU? And that, under our proposal, will be a legally binding referendum. Whatever the people decide in that referendum, that is what our government will implement. And I think that is the right way, finally, to resolve this very difficult and problematic issue. If we go ahead with leaving on the basis of Boris Johnson's deal, there will be years and years of wrangling with the EU. Boris Johnson says he'll negotiate a full free trade deal with Europe by the end of next year. Nobody, apart from him, thinks that is feasible. We could then be in a position of crashing out without a deal. But whatever happens, there will be years of negotiations if that's the route we go down, and serious damage to the British economy. The most important thing for me in my work as a parliamentary representative for my part of East London is to make sure there are decent jobs for people. And if we go ahead on the basis that the Prime Minister is proposing, there will be very severe loss of jobs, and I can't support that.
But aren't we entering into a kind of dangerous period in British politics, whereby the majority of the British people voted to leave the EU in a referendum, and it doesn't look like that is being honoured, and therefore there's a great danger of breakdown of trust between the public and Parliament itself, which leads to anarchy?
Well, I think there's a greater danger of going ahead with a deal which is not supported by the public as a whole and causing great damage to the British economy as a result. So what we're saying is go back to the people. And if the people do say, yep, we want to go ahead on this basis, fine, that's what we will do. That seems to me the democratic way forward.
When it comes down to general elections, the party leaders play a huge part in convincing voters how to vote. What are the characteristics and qualities that do you think that Jeremy Corbyn would make as a Prime Minister?
Well, one of his remarkable achievements, in my mind, is the way he's engaged with young people. We were in real danger of losing a generation of voters, not just from our party, but from democracy as a whole. Young people weren't registering to vote, they weren't bothering to vote. Even if they did register, they were losing interest. And Jeremy seems to have kind of inspired a new generation of voters. And that's, whatever happens in this election, that has been a very important achievement because it gives democracy in Britain another lease of life. Young people can now see that engaging in our democratic processes is important, that it's going to affect their future, that they've got a say, and voting is the way to express that. And I mean, it's in a way, it's rather puzzling because Jeremy is one of the older party leaders to have contested an election in the UK, but he's managed to engage with young people. I don't, I've been, as you mentioned, a member of Parliament for 25 years. I don't think the level of support for the Labour Party amongst young people has ever been as high as it is now, and that is a remarkable achievement and a lasting achievement which will benefit our democracy for a long time to come. And I think it will colour the government that Jeremy leads. We've tended to have governments that have been particularly interested in older people because older people have voted more than younger people. I think it's time that we had a government that listened to younger people. So I think that's an important quality that he'll bring.
Tim, you served under, as a minister, both Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. And one of, I think, Tony Blair's greatest achievement was the fact that when the Labour Party were in power in the 90s, they were considered the party of business and really took that mantle for the Conservative Party. But if you look at your manifesto and the spending pledges, total over £83 billion, which will be paid for by raising higher taxes and extra borrowing. Won't this damage your economy?
Well, we were indeed the party of business at the time. I'm not going to quote it, but I think you'll know what Boris Johnson said about business not very long ago when it was pointed out to him how damaging to business his Brexit proposals were. So the current and modern Conservative Party, I'm afraid, has badly lost the trust of business, which it had for a while under David Cameron, as we had done before, but that's certainly now gone. We published alongside our manifesto a very detailed account of where the money is coming from. The tax rises that you referred to will apply to people earning more than £80,000 a year. We're also going to put corporation tax back up to the level that it was at in 2010. And what that will enable us to do is to fix some of the very, very serious problems that we're running into in communities right across the country. One of the things that I'm most committed to in this manifesto is the commitment to build 100,000 council houses a year. If you look at communities like the one I represent, we've got a massive housing crisis. The council houses that were there before have been sold off. People are having to pay sky-high rents for wholly inadequate and in some cases, frankly, unsanitary accommodation. I met a family the other day, mother and father, both in work. They'd had a child who was age 5, lovely little boy. They had a second child. The child died after a few months. And it was clear that it was the housing conditions that they were living in that was the cause of the problem. We've been in this situation in Britain before. I can remember just in the 1960s, the furore around the BBC play Cathy Come Home that sparked the formation of shelter coming out of the churches at the time, and the Labour government at the time introduced a big programme of council house building. We've got to do the same again. We're a strong economy, we have to recognise our responsibilities as a society, that we cannot have working families where children are dying because of the housing which they have no alternative but to live in. Lots of problems that need to be resolved. That will require the tax changes that we've announced. We've been completely frank about it, much more open than the Conservatives have been, and I think that is the right way forward.
But is not renationalising our national utilities a step back and going back to the 70s? And how much will that cost the British taxpayer? And essentially, will this lead to a disinvestment into the UK?
Well, I think most people feel, for example, that privatisation of the railways has not been a great success. And renationalising will not be costly because they've all got these franchises which run out after a period, and you can, without expense, bring them back into the public sector subsequently. And frankly, I think most people would have greater confidence in public management of the railways than in the companies that we've got doing the job at the moment.
Tim, so we're down to the last 3 minutes of the programme, so I want to ask you a bit more about Labour's position on foreign affairs. So what is Labour's position regarding NATO, our Western security, and fighting international terrorism?
We're, as we always have been, thoroughly committed to NATO. Of course, the Labour government after the Second World War played a key role in setting NATO up, Ernie Bevan as the Foreign Secretary at the time, and that's been the cornerstone of our policy ever since, and it will continue to be in the future.
And also I have to ask you, what is your party doing? I think you mentioned it briefly about the persecutions of Christians that we're seeing around the world, particularly in the Middle East, where they are being ethnically cleansed, and we could see the region soon depleted of its Christian community, which this is the birthplace of Christianity.
We could, and I think that is an unfolding tragedy that a British government needs to take very, very seriously. In a number of parts of the Middle East, and one of the areas that I'm particularly worried about is the plight of Christians in Palestine, who've had a very, very hard time indeed.
Can you clarify the persecution of Christians in Palestine? Because if we look at Bethlehem, we've seen a huge persecution of Christians, not by Israel, but by the Palestinian Authority and by Islamic terror groups like Hamas and others. And that's where the real persecution is taking place, and yet that's not being addressed.
Well, I think it needs to be addressed, but the living conditions in Palestine are very difficult because of, in particular, the actions of the government of Israel, and that has had a serious and damaging effect on Palestinian Christians as well as on Palestinian Muslims. But I think it's very important that we are assertive about this, that we have a government that's bold, that's willing to speak out when bad things are being done to Christians, to other, and indeed when human rights are being infringed in other ways. I'm worried that we're going to end up, if we have a Conservative government, with one that is craven to other governments around the world because it's really desperate to do trade deals, having a bad relationship with the EU, and that's going to make our position very, very weak, and we won't be able to represent and take up the cudgels on behalf of persecuted Christians.
Stephen, I give you an opportunity now to put a pitch to our viewers about why they should vote for the Labour Party for this general election.
I think anybody looking around the UK can see that we've got very serious problems in the health service, which has recently recorded its worst performance for many, many years, in schools, in housing, where there is a real housing crisis in many parts of the UK, and people simply unable to afford adequate housing for themselves and their families. Food banks, and I want to pay a very strong tribute to the work of the churches, the church-based food banks in the Trussell Trust, which have done such a superb job in supporting families in hard times. We need a new start, we need a change of direction, a real change, and that is what the Labour Party manifesto sets out. I want to see that manifesto put into effect, and I think the country would be a much better one if we were able to make that change.
Stephen Timms, thank you so much for being my guest on this election special, and thank you for watching, and remember to vote and pray on Thursday, the 12th of December.